This Christmas may not turn out to be a very happy one for Uday Kotak, the promoter of Kotak Mahindra Bank. The Bombay High Court has refused to stay the Reserve Bank of India's December 31st deadline for the bank to trim its promoter shareholding to 20% of paid-up capital. Remember, Kotak Mahindra Bank had moved the Bombay High Court against the Reserve Banks earlier this month. Basically, after the central bank had told that Uday Kotak should reducing his promoter stake through the preference share issue route doesn't meet the central bank's requirement. So where does today's verdict leave Uday Kotak? Where does it leave Kotak Mahindra Bank? Is there room for more negotiation with the Reserve Bank to look for a middle ground? Is there any other legal recourse available? We discuss all that and more with our guests, Janmejaya Sinha, Chairman Asia Pacific at Boston Consulting Group. Also with us is Mr. R. Gandhi, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and Sandeep Parikh, founder, FinSec Law Advisors. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Let me start with the lawyer first. Sandeep, if you don't get a stay on this deadline, if you were advising Kotak Mahindra Bank, what would you do?
Yeah, I think they've already taken it to the High Court instead of kind of negotiating with the RBI. So I think just look at it from the optics perspective, once you've said that we're going to challenge you in court and you lose, and then you come back and negotiate for an extension, it doesn't look very good for them, really. So ideally, of course, I think they need to go back to RBI and say that we kind of messed up, we're willing to withdraw the writ, please give us 3 months extension and then finish it. Because, these cases in India, as you know, litigation, unless you get a stay immediately, it's kind of, you lost the battle really, because the main case will come after, several years, if not several months. So there may be a second hearing, but again, there's no stay, then, the final hearing will take several years. So I think the gambit has not paid off, and I think they can, of course, litigate more. They can file in the division bench in High Court or go to Supreme Court and all. But again, remember, this is, first of all, there's a principle called judicial due deference, and it's a writ. They will only get into illegality, bias, perversity, etc. They will not get into merits, and they'll say, okay, we have an expert regulator. We will go by what they believe. Okay. Right.
Sandeep, we don't have you on a very clear line. We'll do one thing. We'll take a break now. We are coming back and resuming this conversation, just setting this right. Back in a jiffy. This Christmas may not turn out to be a merry one for Uday Kotak, promoter of Kotak Mahindra Bank. The Bombay High Court has refused to stay Reserve Bank's December 31st deadline for the bank to trim its promoter shareholding to 20% of paid-up capital. Remember, Kotak Mahindra Bank had moved the Bombay High Court against the Reserve Bank earlier this month after the central bank told the bank that Uday Kotak reducing his promoter stake via the issue of preference shares doesn't meet its requirements. So where does this verdict leave Uday Kotak? Where does it leave Kotak Mahindra Bank? Is there room for more legal options, or is there room for negotiation with the Reserve Bank to be able to see whether there can be another middle ground? We discuss all this and more with our guests, Janmejaya Sinha, Chairman Asia Pacific at the Boston Consulting Group. Also with us is Mr. R. Gandhi, former Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India, and Sandeep Parikh. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Well, let me come to you, Mr. Sinha, first. More in terms of what are the practical options for Kotak. Was it wrong to have gone to court first? Would it have made more sense to negotiate with the central bank?
I cannot imagine that Kotak Bank would have gone to court lightly. I just don't believe that. I think they must have tried to, talk to RBI as many times as they could. Because, no regulated entity wants to take its regulator to court. It must be a tight bind that they are in, and one has to look at it from 3 or 4 perspectives and then decide how to look at it. What was it that they were allowed to do what was their original licensing agreement that they had got? Second is, what is fair? And third is, what is possible. Just going and offloading 10% of stake in 10 days is not straightforward. So, and then the question is it a good bank or is it a bad bank? Is it
no,
being
Mr.
well
Sinha,
run or is it a
one
threat
minute,
to the
one
system?
minute, Mr. Sinha.
I would actually look...
They did not have to offload 10% in 10 days. They knew this was coming for the last 2 years. And of course, valuations have been going through the roof. So with each passing day, it was becoming a larger amount of money, to be sure. The argument of whether it is fair is another one. And I thought I will come to it in a bit. But basically, do you think Kotak should have seen this coming? Or did he bank on the fact that earlier, 10 years ago, bank promoters regularly got extension. So he thought that he will also get one.
So, a precedent is an important thing to look at. I mean, what was his original licensing norm? Was it 49 or was it 20 or was it 10? Yeah. When was it changed? What was the wording? I mean, when there is a lot which I have read in the newspapers that RBI said it was not in the spirit of the law. Actually, the actual wording of the letter that he had got was different from what was then later expected.
Yeah.
When you are dealing in these things, you have to be tight, So I would not like to, speculate. I mean, if you are asked to do something, you will follow the letter of that that law. Then you say it's against the spirit. When actually there are many regimes in place, you will get confused. So it could, on the other hand, it's also true that for a long time there has been a movement towards getting to the final destination. But then you have to make the destination clear.
Yeah.
And if any of them are not as clear as they can be, the person has a right to feel aggrieved. Because I don't believe any bank would like to take the regulator to court. It is not done lightly. Okay. You're going to live every day with that regulator. So who takes the regulator to court?
Fair point. Fair point. I take a point over there. And there is, of course, a change in the Reserve Bank's wording. Clearly, in the license condition, they have said paid up capital. And when I read the guidelines for licensing of new banks in the private sector, February 2013, there at every point they are speaking about shareholding and not about paid up equity. Likewise, when you look at the master direction ownership in private sector banks, 2016, May 2016, again over there in the master direction, at all points it is shareholding that is being referred to in the language of the law. But this is not the case in the decade of the 2000s when fit and proper was discussed. It was paid up equity that the Reserve Bank was talking about, and perhaps as Kotak said on record, in his license condition it was paid up capital. But now where does this leave him legally? Sandeep, what's your sense? Can there be any special leave petition, any legal option available, or is Kotak Mahindra Bank clearly violating the law as of Jan 1st, 2019?
So, Lata, whether they're violating the law or not, that's a secondary question right now. I think we need to look at tactics rather than the strategy, long-term strategy. And that's critical because they need to finish something before the 31st of December or stand in compliance. It's still in violation of the law as the RBI understands it. Now, they can do two things. Either they can go down, which means they can go to the RBI and kind of plead with them and say that give us 3 more months to comply. We're willing to withdraw the writ. Again, I'm talking legal strategy. I'm not talking about grand principles of, whether it's capital or voting shares.
Correct.
Or they can move up and say that, okay, the High Court should have given us a stay. We'll go to a larger bench or go to the Supreme Court, etc.
Okay.
The problem is going up in appeal is that, again, usually there's a principle of judicial deference later, which means they normally do not get into the merits of the case. They look at whether there's perversity, bias, illegality, and the like. So normally they say, okay, we have an expert regulator, it knows what it's doing, and we will normally not like to interfere.
Okay.
That's the final ruling. So,
but it's amazing. It's amazing. Kotak did not think that this could be one of the, verdicts of the court that they will not grant a stay. You should have given it more than a 50% chance, shouldn't you?
Not just more than 50% chance, but also, given the short time frame, if they had 6 months or 8 months, it was probably worth a gamble to fight with the regulator. But I think this was really cutting it short because it's, and remember, this is Christmas in the West. So, investors are not going to pick up your calls right now. So it's going to be a tough journey for the next few weeks for Kotak.
Okay. Mr. Gandhi, can you live in violation of the law? Because in the Bandhan Bank case, the bank is already in violation, and therefore it has been meted out a punishment that starting December 31st, I think, they cannot open new branches and the managing director's salary cannot be increased. Can Kotak proceed on the assumption that their penalty will be similar and they will work with that penalty? They will be able to manage probably with electronic banking up to a point. By then they will find people to sell their shares to. So what if you live in violation for a few months? Is that an option?
That's what I think Mr. Kotak and Kotak Mahindra Bank must have factored in the sense that when you cross the line of the debt line, you are liable for regulatory action. Regulatory action need not necessarily be exactly what has been prescribed for the Bandhan Bank. It could be different. So that one should not straight away carry that exactly will apply here. But regulatory penalties will be there. That if Kotak Bank has thought that that is a reasonable cost that we may have to pay until we actually comply with the instruction, that could be a possibility. That could be a strategy also. Not only strategy, that is what will be happening now. Because by 31st December, and even theoretically, before 31st December also, they can do something. We do not know what all the efforts Kotak Bank is making to comply with the instruction. Another 10 days are there.
You mean they can find a buyer? They can find a buyer for the shares, you think?
Yeah, because 10 days are there. So even otherwise, I would presume that they must be negotiating with several people. If something clicks because of that, then that is also a compliance. Okay. So theoretically, there are very many possibilities. You can comply with before 31st. You can live with penalties immediately thereafter until you actually comply. So that's what I think. That's what
they must be counting on. That this may be the penalty. So there are 2 or 3 options. They could be still talking to investors, or they could be willing to live with a Bandhan Bank-like penalty for some time. Though, of course, there's no guarantee that it will be the same penalty. On that issue, Sandeep, the Kotak Bank's position has been off the record when they speak to us that we are the regulated entity. A promoter is not an entity regulated by the Reserve Bank. So technically, RBI can't tell the promoter you bring down your stake. He can tell Kotak Mahindra Bank, you have to arrange your capital in such a way that no promoter owns more than 30%. But that is a killer condition for Kotak Mahindra Bank. They have 2.3 crore shares outstanding. If they have to bring Uday Kotak's stake down from 30% to 10%, they have to issue 1 lakh shares, 1 crore shares more. Now, that will be, 50% more equity has to be raised, which works out about 1 lakh crore. Is that an option at all for the bank?
See, Lata, again, as you said, this is not a 10-day scenario. They knew to do either of the 2 things. And there's a possibility also, which needs to be kept in mind, which is M&A. They did one big M&A a couple of years back. So M&A was possible. Stake dilution by way of issue to new investors, possible sale by the current promoter. So there are multiple combinations which are possible. So to say that they have a gun at their head in the last 10 days is, I don't think, fair. But having said that, I still think that the bigger picture, RBI does need to rethink. First of all, they need to improve their drafting skills. And secondly, they need to rethink whether fragmented shareholding is a panacea which they're claiming it is. Because, we've seen big issues with large private banks where there is fragmented shareholding. So I'm not sure it's kind of a destination, kind of an be-all destination which RBI is looking at.
I take your point entirely, and with that, let's take a break and come back and discuss this broader issue. Does Reserve Bank, not for Kotak Bank's sake, but for the sake of the banking sector itself, need to reconsider its conditions on promoter shareholding? Should it only look at fit and proper? And if a promoter is fit and proper, why is 21% dangerous and why is 20% safe? Does that question need to be asked? And do you think if we proceed in this fashion, we are going to find fewer and fewer Indian shareholders and more foreign shareholders of Indian banks? This special discussion called Kotak versus RBI as we know, the Bombay High Court has not stayed the Reserve Bank's deadline for Kotak Mahindra Bank to bring down the promoter stake to 20% from 30%. So come Jan 1st, Kotak Mahindra Bank is in violation of the Reserve Bank's rules of shareholding, and it is in danger of facing penalty. We've discussed what options it has, and there doesn't seem to be too many, except perhaps negotiating with the central bank, a difficult thing to do when you have just taken them to court. But let's now look at the rules themselves. Janmeja Sinha, your thoughts. Up until through the 2000s, the Reserve Bank only spoke of fit and proper qualifications for promoters. It did not give them a shareholding limit. And even now there's confusion. Voting rights for widely held institutions who own shares goes all the way to 26%, and such entities can hold up to 40%. Like, for instance, a Fairfax, or for instance, maybe if it comes to it, a Berkshire, they can hold up to 40%. But the promoter himself can hold only 15%. In any case, voting rights are available up to 26%. There are too many numbers over here without adequate justification. Would you say we need to rethink rules of private sector ownership?
So actually, I think this is a very important question and a very important discussion. Let's divide this into three separate buckets. First, what is normatively good? And I think Sandeep was making a very important point. The global financial crisis happened with very widely dispersed holdings for very large banks, you know. And actually what happened in those situations were that the managements had no control, and actually they were privatizing the profits and socializing the losses, as you can see what happened ultimately. The second issue is, are the guidelines that are in place clear, fair, and the same for everyone? You know, and I think in the Indian banking sector requires a level playing field. That includes public sector banks, old private sector banks, new private sector banks. What are the guidelines? Can we actually articulate them simply, sharply, and clearly? And then the third issue is, how does Mr. Kotak now deal with the fact that the High Court has not given the bank a stay order? On that we've already discussed. So now if we take the other 2 points, I think, you know, and since 2013, I am in agreement with what Sandeep says, that, you know, this widely dispersed shareholding, is it a good or is it a bad? And how do we know this? The world is actually undergoing dramatic changes nowadays. The Anglo-Saxon and the Washington consensus is under challenge, okay? And it's under challenge, and we need to appreciate what is the best structure for us. You know, widely dispersed, you know, if you look at HDFC Bank or ICICI Bank, they are largely foreign banks right now, you know, with dispersed holdings which are held by foreigners, right?
Yes.
So we really need to actually answer this question quite seriously. And I think there should be an expert committee that is set up which actually goes into this matter with some depth.
Yes.
Actually, and look at it very clearly to say what is a normative good, what do we want to have. And then the second thing is clearing the past. It's always difficult because there are so many rules that have been put in place, and they are applying disparately, and so those have to be made standard.
Let me ask Mr. Gandhi, because he has been through most of that period. Mr. Gandhi, you would know that Y.V. Reddy made a speech recently pointing out that the way in which banks are held in India, the public sector banks are held largely by government and LIC with very little Indian shareholding, and the private sector banks, especially the very good retail ones, are held largely by foreigners, again with very little Indian shareholding. So before I come to Mr. Gandhi, you know, what's your sense about this, Sandeep? Do you think the rules need to be rewritten? You saw the proxy voting. Proxy voters and foreign investors in the HDFC case questioning Deepak Parekh and a whole host of other directors. Now, you may find a lot of promoters in danger because foreign shareholders will be led by their proxy advisory firms. Should we allow promoters more skin in the game?
I think so. And, you know, I think Janmeja also made some other significant points with respect to having a level playing field for everybody. I don't think you can make rules as you go. So I think there has to be one philosophy, one vision. Everybody kind of sticks to that vision. But of course, I think thinking more deeply about that vision is also important, because you can't just say that having promoters is bad or having fragmented shareholding is bad. I mean, there are pros and cons to each. And, there are different models which have various benefits. So I think it has to be thought of with a little more rigor and then applied equally, fairly and uniformly.
Yeah. If the promoter is, say, Ramesh Gelli, then you don't want a promoter to hold 40%. You want them to be widely held. But if a promoter is like Uday Kotak, who has done a very good job of his bank, you would feel, why not allow more skin in the game? So obviously you can't have different rules. Right? That's the point you're making.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it can't be based on whether it's Mr. Gelli or not. It's basically.
No, my point is, why not?
It should fall foul of fit and proper rules, that you should person should not have a single vote then.
Exactly. My point. That is the point I was going to ask Mr. Gandhi as well. Mr. Gandhi, in the 2000s, that used to be the Reserve Bank stand. If you are fit and proper, then percentages don't come in the way. They would allow promoters to hold a larger stake and extend guidelines if needed, or even the guidelines did not even mention any such numbers. But somewhere in the 2013 to 16 period, we started putting percentages, probably because licenses were going on tap. That may have been the reason. But do you think we need to rethink? If you're fit and proper, 40% is fine, 35 is fine. But if you're not fit and proper, even 20 or 10 is too much. Should we start thinking on those lines?
Say, but the regulations have been framed in this way. That is, to begin with, fit and proper promoters are allowed even up to 40 or even past 40 for a period. The period has been defined as 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, or whatever it is. So after that period, continued large holding by individual promoter or promoter group, that is what has been considered as a not a desirable item. That is why there has been prescriptions that after a period you should be bringing down your holding. That's the stance Reserve Bank has taken in these years. So it is not that Reserve Bank was against somebody holding larger stake. That has been permitted, including, as I said, even beyond 40 also. Even a recent case which you quoted also, it has been allowed more than 40. The point is how long they can hold that large position. That is what is under discussion, or that is what is being disputed. Reserve Bank has taken a stance that given a long period of 10 to 15 years or whatever, that is sufficient. By the time they should be broadly, widely held. So that's a position it has taken. There, I don't think we cannot be talking it is fair or unfair, because that has been transparently, it has been prescribed for all.
Yeah. Now, I take a point just very quickly, since I don't have any time for further threshing out this issue. Do you think, Mr. Sinha, that the dice is getting loaded in favor of big institutions owning 40%, which means a Fairfax, a Berkshire, or these large institutions can hold 40%, but individual Indians, say Uday Kotak or a Rasesh Shah, will never be able to hold a large stake? Do you think we have to rethink the rules? Has the time come?
So I actually think that it's a very good time. Periodically, every 10 years, these rules should always be reviewed. And they should be reviewed by an expert committee in the light of the developments that have taken place across the world. And then the moment we have an agreement on that normative vision, we should then try and ensure that there is a level playing field which applies equally to all.
Okay.
I really feel that that's a really important thing, and we really need to do
Okay,
that.
let me squeeze one quick word. Mr. Sinha, what would you do if you're Uday Kotak today?
I would first go and talk to RBI. I would also talk to investors. I would also figure out, what the penalties are likely to be, and and then decide which way to go ahead. I mean, look, I don't believe he wanted to go to court. That I don't believe.
Oh, right. Well, anyway, that really is the micro issue. The bank, Kotak Mahindra Bank, has to negotiate with the regulator and with its shareholders. It's in a sticky spot, you will have to say. But on a larger plane, we really need to perhaps once again look at the rules governing promoters of private sector banks and how much shareholding they should be permitted? Should it be a quantitative assessment at all, quantitative level at all, or should it be simply qualitative? If you are fit and proper, these percentages should not apply. That debate perhaps can be raised once again. Janmejaya Sinha, Mr. Gandhi and Sandeep Parekh, thank you very much for this conversation. I'm sure we are going to have many more such debates on this issue in the days to come.